Hey there, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thank you so much for joining me today for another art video. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my entire freehand preliminary sketching process, and this is what I go through whenever I am preparing an outline sketch prior to getting started with a new watercolor piece, prior to getting started with developing more realistic shading for a more realistic study of sorts, or prior to getting started with pen and ink. Along the way, as I am sharing this method that I go through, I'm going to be sharing a ton of super helpful tips that are going to help you improve your freehand sketching, arrive at much better proportions, much better perspective, much better shape, and overall use of drawing space. All right, so without much further ado, let's go ahead and get started. The very first thing that I want to share with you is the reference photo that I am using to create this sketch today. So this is a photo that I found several months back via Pexels, Pixabay, or Unsplash.com, one of those places where you can download high-resolution reference photos for free. I just wanted to show you this reference photo so that you can have a chance to take it in and see it before getting started, which I feel is so important to do. It's so important to take a moment to sit and observe our reference, observe overall shapes and forms, observe overlapping elements, observe the light situation, the lights, midtones, and darks. Where do you feel the light source is located in this particular case? Observe any interesting perspectives that might be going on with those three-dimensional forms involved in the piece. Any interesting looking textures that you might need to practice any specific techniques for. And the very last thing that I wanted to share with you guys before getting started is that the process that I'm going to be sharing with you next is exactly what I do, whether I am drawing from direct observation, otherwise known as drawing from life, or whether I am using a reference photo. Practice both, because both drawing from reference photo as well as from direct observation are very useful, and they are very different types of experiences that are going to help us make faster progress if we practice with both. Aside from this is also the exact same process that I go through. It doesn't matter what kind of subject I am sketching, whether it's an animal, a still life arrangement, a portrait, a landscape, whatever it is. I always go through this same process and apply the main points that I'm going to be sharing with you next. Of course, when you're drawing something like a portrait or even an animal or the human figure, all of that requires knowledge of anatomy and very specific proportions, and in my opinion, also the knowledge of the three-dimensional structure of whatever it is you're trying to draw. Because no amount of drawing technical skills is going to make up for that lack of knowledge of very specific anatomy. So if you're looking to develop your skills in those areas, I would highly recommend looking into anatomy, unless you're only going to be adding those things in a very abstract kind of way. And this is one of the reasons why I always recommend beginners get started with their knowledge of art fundamentals and drawing skills and observational skills via still life arrangements or objects, and then move on to more complex subjects. Okay, so here are the simple drawing supplies that I'm going to be using today. You can see how I'm not using anything fancy. These are just 3 drawing pencil grades, and these are an HB, a 3B, and an 8B. I just have a soft graphite eraser with me and a metallic sharpener, and that's all. If you're not aware of what drawing pencil grades are or how they can come in handy during the drawing process, check out a link that I'm going to be leaving for you down below in the description box to my free drawing mini course for the total beginner, in which I walk you through the different basic drawing supplies and explain all about different drawing pencil grades. That is going to be left down below for you in case you'd like to go and check it out. Okay, so I am getting started here with my HB pencil, and as you can see, I am drawing very, very lightly, and I'm sorry that it appears so light on screen, but this is actually the lightness that I use, and it's a very important part of this process. So I did not want to draw more dark or exert more pressure on my pencil than I actually do when I am doing it for myself, because this is a huge part of the process. Why? Because you have to be able to refine your shapes, modify things, erase mistakes, correct mistakes along the way. And if you draw too hard, too dark, you press your pencil on your page way too much, then you're not going to be able to erase your mistakes. You're going to be scratching and burnishing your paper, and there is no way to take that back. Add to this the fact that if you're going to be creating realistic shading, which I am not going to be doing today, I'm going to be using alternative shading techniques later on, but if you're planning on this being a realistic shading study of sorts, you do not want those outlines to be showing at the end. You want those outlines to disappear and become edges instead of outlines after you've developed all of your different values. There really are no outlines when it comes to higher levels of realism, so that's just something to have in mind. If that's what you're going for, then it's also another reason why it's so important to draw lightly. Outlines lead to flatness, and especially when I'm going for higher levels of realism, which I'm not going to be doing today, I want to make sure that that outline sketch completely disappears by the end. Okay, so what I am doing here with my HB pencil very lightly is I am drawing in my envelopes. Why do I like referring to these as envelopes? Because I am imagining the forms that I am seeing in my reference photo as being wrapped with wrapping paper or some sort of paper that leads to angular lines, angular shapes. That is what I am visualizing when I am laying down these preliminary shapes. I am not thinking of curves. I am thinking more of angles. I am not thinking of irregular lines. I am thinking more of straight lines. Why am I doing this? Because my brain understands simple shapes and horizontal and vertical lines or simpler lines much more easily than irregular shapes. And with these oversimplified shapes in place, I am much better able to arrive at effective proportions and sizes of different elements in regards to each other and all of this, because I'm better able to compare them in terms of their length, width, the angles they create upon each other, etc. And once everything looks good to me in terms of their overall size, their location, and their overall proportions, then I allow myself to go in and refine those shapes into curves and, designs that are taking place in the particular elements in the photo and all of this. And as I am doing this, as I continue adding elements in, I am constantly looking at my reference photo and comparing everything in terms of their sizes and everything, length, width, location within space, over and over and over again. Using my visual measuring skills, which I promise you, if you continue doing this kind of exercise, they will improve. And if you find it helpful, this is also something that I do. I constantly divide the elements into halves, into thirds, into fourths, either vertically or horizontally, whenever I find it helpful, and I compare my other elements to that. You don't only have to compare the height of that particular object with the other height of that other object, but you can also divide each object into halves and compare halves to each other if you find that helpful. In this particular case, for example, I noticed that that overall height to that pear that is sideways on that table there, if I compare that height to the vase behind it, or that pitcher of water or whatever it is, I can tell that it's around the half of the height of that pitcher. As I start adding in these grapes, you're probably going to notice how I create little tick marks for myself very, very lightly before actually drawing in the shape of the grape. And when you're drawing in things like these grapes or anything in which there are lots of little overlapping elements, really take note of how they are overlapping, how things are covering each other up in different areas, and really notice those edges. What I notice sometimes is that if we don't pay attention to those edges and those little overlapping sections, things might end up looking like they're floating in the air and not sitting in space surrounded by these other elements. And another huge aspect of my freehand sketching process that I always do is I always get started with the largest elements first and make my way towards the smaller elements and details until the largest elements are already set in place and already look good to me. I do not move on to the smaller elements and the details until the larger elements look good. And the reason I do this is because those largest elements are taking up the majority of the space. And by setting them in place effectively in my drawing area, there's just a greater chance that I'm going to be able to use up my drawing space more effectively and that everything is going to fit. I see a lot of beginner artists get started with their drawings from left to right, or from right to left, or from top to bottom, or vice versa, or focusing on completing one element, then moving on to another element, then moving on to the other element, and so on. And I don't see this as helpful because many times what happens is that they end up running out of space, or overall proportions or shapes are just not effectively recreated, which is what we need if we're going for higher levels of realism. If we're going for more stylized drawings or illustrations, then we don't really have to pay so much attention to specific proportions or shapes and things like that, and that is okay. But when you're looking to develop higher levels of realism in your work, then those proportions, those shapes, those perspectives that have to be created in that preliminary sketch need to be effectively done. And I know that there are more skilled artists out there who work from one side of the piece to the other side of the piece. However, they have developed very high observational skills. Probably they already know how to recreate shapes effectively. They maybe even know about the proportions and overall three-dimensional structure of whatever it is they're drawing or painting, or many times they just have one single subject or element within space that they are drawing or painting, which is easier to accommodate into that drawing area. But whenever there are many different elements involved in the piece, it's much more helpful to look at everything as a whole and focus on the largest elements first. Whatever the case may be, I think it's important to realize that as artists, we are designing visual compositions that are meant to be seen as a whole. So we shouldn't get stuck with any specific section or element within that composition. We should be seeing everything as a group of elements that are telling the same story, right? So yeah, maybe we have a focal point and one of these elements or sections are going to be more important than others. However, all of the rest of the elements are supporting that and are all communicating the same story, the same message, as complex or simple as that message might be. So I really like acknowledging everything as, I don't know, like a forest. And then once that forest is designed, I then move on to adding details to the trees in that forest, so to speak. A lot of beginners get stuck with one single tree and they don't pay enough attention to the relationships between all of these different parts that are working ultimately together to create one same piece that is meant to be seen as a whole. All right, before moving forward with the rest of this freehand sketching process and the rest of my tips, I want to quickly send out a huge warm welcome to everyone that is just visiting my channel today for the very first time. Welcome. I am so happy that you found my channel, and do consider subscribing because every single week I share new videos with art tips, drawing and painting tutorials, and encouragement and mindset tips for artists. I would love to have you here and become part of this growing art community. All right, let's get back into it. As you continue adding more and more elements into your drawing, you're gonna have more anchor points, more points of comparison, and the more elements you start adding in, most likely than not, you're gonna notice little things that need to be corrected. you add in maybe a grape over here or something like that. And then you notice that something may have to be widened a bit or made a little bit taller or whatever the case may be. The more elements you start adding in, the more you're going to notice your mistakes, and then you can fix those mistakes, which hopefully you're going to be able to do with no problem if you're drawing lightly. Another tip that I don't want to forget to mention is if you find it helpful to lay down any vertical or even horizontal lines when you're creating this preliminary outline sketch to help you with proper alignment or simply to compare the distances and sizes of the different elements involved, go ahead and create those straight vertical and horizontal lines. Just make sure that you create them very, very lightly. Because again, our brains are much better able to compare things to each other if we see a line that is straight, vertical, or horizontal, and you use that as a point of comparison, as a guide. A lot of artists out there, portrait artists and other types of artists, use lines that are referred to as plumb lines to help them with correct alignment and everything like that. And these kinds of lines I personally see as very, very different to something like a grid, because these kinds of lines are only placed along the way in areas where you could find them helpful to help you with alignment and proportions and all of that, as opposed to grids, which I find do not help you as much with your freehand drawing skills and your ability to see everything as a whole and move your entire arm in a more expressive way, because grids divide your picture into all of these little rectangles and squares, and it forces you to see only a part of that shape, a part of that line, and you're trying to perfectly recreate only part of that shape or line as opposed to seeing everything as a whole, which seeing everything as a whole and being able to compare the different elements to each other is essential in order to be able to recreate proportions effectively freehand. So that is why I don't feel grids are helpful in the long run if you're looking to improve your freehand drawing skills. Aside from this, usually when beginners make use of grids, and I'm not saying this is the case for artists who are more skilled and more knowledgeable, because people who already know how to draw, who already know how to paint, and have already gained an understanding of the anatomy of whatever it is they are drawing or painting, that's something else. They're using a grid to quicken that process for themselves. But usually when beginners use only grids since the beginning and for a long period of time, they are just thinking of copying section by section, and they're not really pushing themselves to become expressive with their mark making or to get to know the subject as a three-dimensional structure or the anatomy of the subject, which is so, so important. I like taking my time when I am working on my preliminary sketches to ensure that everything is spot on before moving forward with any kind of shading that I'm going to be doing. Right here, you're seeing me get started with my hatching and cross hatching. I think it's very important not to rush that preliminary sketching process, especially if you're doing it freehand and if you're attempting to go for a higher level of realism, because that perspective, the proportions, the shapes, and all of this, they have to be spot on before moving on to anything else, because it's the base and the foundation for everything else. I think it's important to remember that no amount of shading, texture, or detail is gonna fix errors in proportion and in perspective. And so many of us get very excited to move on to shading and detail and texture and stuff like that when that foundation is faulty and everything ends up falling apart or looks off at the end, and we end up wasting a lot of time working on shading and texture when at the end something is going to look off. So just remember not to rush the process for your preliminary outline sketch, especially if you're looking to go for higher levels of realism, and especially if you're doing this freehand. Remember that drawing is a refinement process. It's not like when you are writing your name or a sentence, in which you're expected to write everything perfectly right off the bat. When we're drawing, that's what erasers are for. It's a constant refinement process, and we're constantly comparing our drawing to our reference along the way and making corrections. For me, I just like knowing that the way that I'm approaching my drawing and my sketching practice is helping me with being able to improve my drawing and my sketching from direct observation. If I feel that the way that I am practicing is not helping me or pushing me towards becoming better at drawing from direct observation, which, as I mentioned before, means drawing from life, having the model right in front of you, then it's not really pushing me in the direction that I want to go in. Because again, I want to be able to do everything completely freehand. I want to be able to recreate a certain level of realism and proportions and everything like that completely freehand. And I am totally okay with having a certain level of imperfection in my artwork. And I am not really interested, or my personal artistic goals don't really revolve around creating carbon copies of a photograph or even something that I have in front of me in real life. Even though I do like using references as a loose base of inspiration to jump off from and to inform myself of important things that are going to help bring a certain level of realism that I am looking for, I am not trying to copy the reference bit by bit, and I am always looking to change things up and bring myself into my artwork. All this said, when I was just getting started with drawing and painting, I did tend to leave my references the way they were. I didn't change things up as much because I knew that it was very important to not only get to know my drawing and painting mediums, but I was also just starting to develop my observational skills, my knowledge about all of these important art fundamentals such as light behavior, perspective, value in three-dimensional form. I was just starting to learn about compositional design and all of this, and I feel it's a lot to take in at once. So in the beginning, I did do a lot more of what you could consider copying, and then I tended to bring myself more into the picture once my skills and confidence increased. But anyway, I know that all of us have different artistic goals. I just wanted to share what it's been like for me, the things that I've done in order to get to the point that I want to get to, and what I look for in terms of practicing mindfully so that I can get there faster. So I totally respect everyone's goals. I know that there are people out there who primarily want to learn how to use color and are not even interested in learning how to draw freehand. And hey, that's perfectly okay. I respect everyone's goals. But I do think I wanted to share this with you because it's important to realize what personal goals you have and make sure that you're going for the certain exercises that are going to help you get there. Otherwise, it's going to take you way longer. And your goals can definitely, for sure, change as you move forward and you continue discovering more about who you are as an artist and what it is that you want to share with the world and how. That's totally normal too. Okay, so I have now fully explained everything that I make sure to do and go through as I am creating my preliminary outline sketches before getting started with any new watercolor piece, any pen and ink piece, or any graphite piece that I am intending to develop more realistic shading with or on. And along the way, I have shared tons of tips that are going to help you progress your freehand drawing skills much faster. At this point, you're seeing me work on my alternative shading. I absolutely love alternative shading, which I use with both pen and ink as well as graphite. Right here, I am using, as I said before, hatching and cross hatching to develop all of my different value areas. And At this point in the process, I am using my softest pencil grade that I chose for this piece, which is my 8B. Prior to this, in between my outline sketch and this darker pencil grade, I use my 3B pencil to lay down those initial layers of hatching and cross hatching. So I hope that right here you can get an idea of how I moved from hardest pencil grade to softest pencil grade as I moved on to developing darker values via this alternative shading technique. Something I often like doing at the very end of my alternative shading process is going in with a little bit of scribbling here and there along some of the edges of some of these elements, especially where very dark values are located. And this very light, elongated kind of scribbling that I create along some of those edges helps me add contrast. It helps me add a little bit of definition here and there. And it also helps me add a little bit of line weight variation, because I always want to stay away from the look of harsh, continuous looking outlines with one same visual weight, whether it's thickness or darkness, all throughout my different elements, because as I was mentioning before, this creates a lot of flatness. So even though I am not going for realistic shading in this case, I am still making sure that those quote unquote outlines around my different elements all have line weight variation within them. And if you notice, there are some segments in which those lines are not even connecting at all. Okay, so I'm gonna leave you to hopefully enjoy the rest of this alternative shading process. I'm gonna make sure to leave links to other drawing and sketching videos that I've created in the past, which you're gonna find super helpful, especially if you're just getting started on your drawing and sketching journey. And I'm also going to leave links to alternative shading technique tutorials that I've created in the past. So all of that is going to be left down below for you in the description box in case you'd like to go and check it out. And you're also going to be able to find the links to all of the different drawing supplies that I used to create this sketch today. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did. And if so, please make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you get immediate access to my most exclusive resources in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated tutorials that I don't share anywhere else. All of the tutorials that I share over on Patreon include my downloadable outline sketch, my high-resolution reference photos, and my supply lists, including the list of specific colors that I use for the piece on hand. Patreon community members also have access to my weekly sketchbook prompts, which are designed to help you stay consistent and making progress as an artist. There's also a library of classes on art fundamentals that now has over 20 classes in it, and that gets added to each and every month. Monthly live Q&A sessions with me in which community members get to ask me anything they'd like, feedback from me on your work, and much more. So go ahead and check it out. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, so you can pick whichever one you need. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that down below in the description box. All right, everyone, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, that you learned something new, or that you found it inspiring. If you did like it, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows more artists to get to know about my channel. Thank you so very much for watching today. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments for me, make sure to leave them down below in the comment section. I always love hearing from you guys and read every single one of your comments. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and stay inspired. Bye guys!